Alright guys, welcome to the lecture on Chapter 18, Section 3, Acquiring New Lands. The objective today is to learn about U.S. relations with Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, and the essential question is, how did American imperialism develop across the globe? So in 18.2 we left off talking about the Spanish-American War and the fact that the United States of America was able to defeat the Spanish and drive them out of Puerto Rico, Cuba, the Philippines. And now in 18.3, we learn about the relationships between the U.S. and these three countries immediately following the Spanish-American War. Now, originally in Cuba, many people were extremely excited for the United States of America to become involved in this conflict and for them to force the Spanish out of Puerto Rico. But over time, Puerto Ricans became a little wary of U.S. control. Talking about freedom and exercising their freedom now that they're free from the shackles of Spanish control, they consider ideas of having their own true independence, free from any control at all. But Puerto Rico loses that independence when it's acquired by the United States of America. The Spanish had not kept a real tight leash on the Puerto Ricans, and they had experienced some nominal independence in Puerto Rico, but the United States of America was definitely going to have an eye on them and become involved not only in their economy and society, but also in their politics. The Foraker Act, passed by the United States Congress, denies Puerto Rican citizenship and self-determination. In addition to that, it said the United States of America and the President would choose who the governor of Puerto Rico was and who all the members of the upper house of their legislature would be. Puerto Ricans could then vote on the lower house, but certainly the governor and the upper house were the ones that were going to hold the most political power in this equation. What this does is this gives the United States a direct tie and control over Puerto Rican politics and, more importantly, the Puerto Rican market and the economy. Eventually, Puerto Ricans are granted citizenship in 1917, and it remains a territory of the United States of America still today. Cuba, not a territory, but a protectorate, and they're a little bit different. We'll talk about the difference between the two in just a moment. So what's going on in Cuba? Well, as we spoke about in 18.2, when the United States of America decided to become involved in the Spanish-American War, the U.S. made it known that we were not becoming involved because we were becoming imperialistic. We were becoming involved to help the Cubans free themselves from the evil empire of Spain and General Weyler and all the atrocities that were going down in Cuba. To make sure the world knew that, the United States of America actually passed the Teller Amendment. The Teller Amendment stated that the United States of America would basically allow Cuba to, the Cubans, to live free and independent of any European or American control following the war. That the U.S. was only involving itself in this war for the best of intentions, to free the Cubans from under Spanish rule. And the U.S. does bring many improvements in health and sanitation to Cuba, but it does not give them full independence. Now, the U.S. directly controlled Puerto Rican society and politics, which is why Puerto Rico was a territory. But we didn't directly control Cuba. So Cuba became a protectorate, a country that's under indirect control of a greater, more powerful country. That's what Cuba was. The U.S. basically voids the Teller Amendment by writing the Platt Amendment. So what happens is, following the Spanish-American War, the Cubans are very excited. They have this freedom, right? Freedom that was promised by the United States of America through the Teller Amendment. So they write a constitution, and they think everything's great with this constitution. But then the United States of America sees the constitution. And in the Cuban constitution, it doesn't say anything about its relationship with the U.S. And the United States government realizes, hold on a second, we did not get involved in this war, fight in this war, and win this war, and get literally nothing out of the deal. There was a huge amount of business and economic interest by United States politicians and businessmen in Cuba. It was critically important that the infrastructure of Cuba and the different industries in Cuba continue to thrive, because their success directly leads to financial and business and political success in the United States of America. Because of that, the U.S. decided to draft the Platt Amendment, which would basically be an addendum to the Cuban Constitution. The Platt Amendment more or less said that the United States of America could control Cuba in order to preserve life, liberty, or property. And I'll talk more about the Teller Amendment and the Platt Amendment in just a moment. So as you can see, the United States of America has backtracked on its promise from the beginning of the war. Now, it's not so convenient following the war to stick to that promise. And so we have now made Cuba a protectorate, which once again is when a smaller, weaker country is controlled in some way by a larger, stronger country. Maybe not having direct control like a territory, but is controlled or protected in some way, whether it's the economy, the people, whatever it is. So if we take a look at the Teller Amendment and the Platt Amendment and excerpts from each, we will be able to see the difference between the two. The Teller Amendment, prior to the war, hereby disclaims any disposition of the intention to exercise sovereignty, jurisdiction, or control over said island except for the pacification thereof, and asserts its determination, when that is accomplished, to leave the government and control of the island to its people. So as you can see, the United States is saying the only reason they're going in there is to pacify the Spanish and the unrest and create peace on the island. And then once they do that, they will give the government and control of the island to its people. It sounds too good to be true, and that's because it was. The Teller Amendment, the Platt Amendment is a bit different. It allowed the United States, quote, the right to intervene for the preservation of Cuban independence, the maintenance of a government adequate for the protection of life, property, and individual liberty. And while it looks like the motivations might be pure from the United States based on them protecting life, property, and individual liberty, one thing the United States was really concerned with is that the government in Cuba would fall into disrepair, the economy would suffer, the society would suffer, and if any of those things happen, other European powers could look towards potential colonization opportunity in Cuba. And that was the last thing the United States of America wanted. So they passed the Platt Amendment to make sure they could keep an eye on Cuban society and its economy and the government to make sure that things turned out the way they wanted it to. And that brings us to the Philippines. Now I have a question up here. How is the Philippines different from Cuba? Well, in a few different ways. Number one, the Philippines had a face to their rebellion. Emilio Aguinaldo, who was mentioned last section in 18.2. He's the leader of the Filipino rebels against the Spanish, and later becomes the leader of the Filipino rebels against the United States of America. But the Philippines isn't in the Caribbean like Puerto Rico and Cuba. The Philippines is in Asia, and it is significantly closer to the China market than any other land the United States has access to. This makes the Philippines extremely important. Some type of occupation in the Philippines would provide the United States with the business and trade interests that it has always sought in Asia, and will create an entirely new opportunity and market for the United States of America. Now, many Filipinos at this time, including Emilio Aguinaldo, felt like the United States, like I mentioned in 18.2, felt like the United States was being hypocritical, and that's because we were. Following the freeing of the Filipinos from Spanish control, the United States of America actually takes over control of the Philippines. And we create reconcentration camps. There are atrocities of murdering, raping, and beating individual rebels and families, the destruction of entire villages, and forced Americanization. Now, there's a very rough 5-ish year period during the war and immediately after, where some very unsavory things went on in the Philippines, mostly at the hands of the United States of America. Eventually, the United States of America decides to annex the Philippines, and we make the Philippines a protectorate. And it stays a protectorate until July 4th, 1946, after World War II. After we annex the Philippines and make it a protectorate, things begin to turn around then. William Howard Taft, President Taft, which we talked about last chapter, governs the Philippines for 4 years, setting up an infrastructure and school system and health system in the Philippines that they had never imagined before, bringing a huge amount of advancement in medicine, education, culture to the Philippines, something that they still have us to thank for today. Now, the way we did it was not of the most pure intentions or actions, but in the long run, our occupation of the Philippines, at least on paper, had a positive effect. I'm sure if you talk to many native Filipinos today, they might still hold a grudge or resent the United States for the occupation of the Philippines. But for the most part, it has been a positive benefit to the islands. But keep in mind, we were just as hypocritical as men like Emilio Aguinaldo claimed that we were. And to pretend like we weren't would just be ignoring the facts of the situation. So I've talked about the Philippines and how that would give us access to China. Well, what about China? So at this time, many different countries were trading in China. We want exports to China. So the big question here is, why did the U.S. support the open door? The open door policy is just this idea that the other European nations in China open a door to allow the United States of America to have an economic sphere of influence in China, to give it trading rights in China. We didn't want to dominate China, we just wanted a piece of it. France, Germany, Britain, and Russia all were profiting big time off of the Chinese market. The United States wasn't. So that's what this open door means. Now, once again, why did we want it? We wanted exports to China, especially to build railroads. Number two, we wanted to protect the free market abroad. And this is always extremely important for Americans, especially at this time, to protect the free market. And what that means is we want to make sure we are not locked out of any specific region when it comes to trade or business interests. U.S. Secretary of State John Hay proposes the open door policy. This open door policy is this idea that the Chinese should always remain independent and they should be free to trade with whomever they want, whenever they want. And we didn't want to fall behind the European powers. Like I mentioned, France, Germany, Britain, Japan, Russia, and even the Dutch are all busy, carving up China and profiting off of the Chinese market. We weren't, so we wanted to make sure we had that opportunity. Unsurprisingly, native Chinese did not want all of these European powers meddling in their business. In 1900, there was a secret group called the Boxers that rebelled against this foreign influence. This Boxer rebellion was quickly put down by the foreign powers, a significant amount of them being American forces. Following the Boxer Rebellion, the United States of America issued the second version of the Open Door Notice, in which the United States made it very clear to all these European powers that they are going to make sure, we are going to go above and beyond to make sure this open door stays open. And if any European or foreign power tries to close it or shove us out of the trade, it's going to be a huge issue. So we made it very clear that this was our interest and this is what we were willing to do to support it. That's it for 18.3. If you have any questions, as always, please feel free to ask your history teacher.